Isn't it strange how a guard's shift begins with nothing but a gate's soft creak and a dawn that sounds like old POW memories breathing back to life? They pressed him with rules, cold ones, yet he hesitated when the refugee girl's scarf slipped toward the ice as if mercy itself had paused beside him. And when his service coin clicked in his palm under the first beam of morning light, something warmer than protocol finally rose to the surface. Still, that little drawing she left behind keeps returning at daybreak, asking him who he chose to be. At dawn guard, Walt Brenner stood beside the Red Cross parcel shelf, rubbing the edge of an old service coin he kept tucked deep in his coat pocket. A bluish haze still hung over the depot, the kind that softened every sound and made the world feel as if it hadn't quite woken. Out on the siding bench, the quiet refugee girl sat with her knees drawn up, a thin green scarf trembling around her neck whenever the wind pushed through the platform. She watched the tracks, the way someone watches something far away inside their own thoughts, not expecting comfort, just waiting for the next moment to arrive. Frank came down the main hallway holding a clipboard against his chest boots, clicking a little too sharply for the hour. He stopped near the Red Cross window and looked from Walt to the girl, then to the frost collecting like white dust along the edge of the boards. "Protocol isn't weather-dependent," he said, tapping the clipboard as if the rules were printed on its back. His breath rose in short clouds while he spoke. Walt held his own breath for a moment, choosing not to answer. There were mornings when Frank sounded like a man repeating lines he didn't believe in, and this felt like one of them. The depot lights flickered once and steadied. Across the lobby, the glass front of the old library case caught a pale stripe of dawn and returned it across the room. Walt's eyes followed that reflection as though it might tell him something, maybe how long they had until the first train rolled through, maybe how cold the girl really was. She tugged her scarf tighter and glanced at the schedule board, her fingers shaking a little, whether from the temperature or the long night she'd spent there. Walt shifted his weight and ran his thumb across the coin again, warming the metal with the heat of his palm. A moment of stillness settled between them, broken only by a distant whistle echoing from farther down the line. Walt stepped toward the platform and scanned the rails, noticing frost glazing the steel in thin, uneven sheets. The air smelled of damp wood and old engine grease, the familiar scent of every morning he'd worked here. He turned back toward the girl briefly. She offered a small tentative smile, the kind people give when they aren't sure if they're allowed to ask for help. Walt gave a quiet nod in return, not trusting his voice to carry gently enough. Frank moved closer, lowering his clipboard just enough for his expression to soften. "Train's early today," he added the words hanging between duty and concern, as if he wasn't sure which side he was supposed to stand on. The depot seemed to lean into silence again, waiting for the first rumble on the tracks for the morning to declare itself fully awake, for something, anything, to signal what kind of day it was going to be. Walt watched the horizon brighten and felt the weight of the coin in his hand steady and familiar, while the cold wind pushed through the siding once more. Walt kept his voice low, almost swallowed by the cold air between them. "She's freezing, Frank." The words came out rougher than he meant, shaped by worry more than frustration. Frank didn't look up from his clipboard. Regulations don't make exceptions. He said it the way someone repeats a line they've been told to believe, not the way a man chooses his own truth. The sentence hung there like another draft of cold wind, sharper than the rest. The quiet refugee girl shifted on her feet and inched closer, her scarf slipping off one shoulder. "Train safe?" she asked, barely louder than the rustle of paper on Frank's clipboard. Her accent softened every consonant, turning the question into something fragile and uncertain. Walt glanced toward the old library case in the corner of the lobby, its glass reflecting the first hints of stronger daylight. He often checked that reflection when he needed to make sense of something. This morning it showed only a man caught between duty and decency, and the reflection didn't offer an answer either. He knelt by the edge of the platform and ran a gloved hand across the frost. The ice layered itself unevenly thin in one spot and solid enough in another to catch the dim light like brittle glass. As Walt pressed a fingertip to the colder patch, the edge of his service honor coin glinted from inside his palm. He closed his hand around it, not for luck, but for steadiness, for memory, for the quiet resolve that coin always brought him. The girl crept closer, her breath forming small clouds that drifted above the rail. A sharp gust tore down the platform, lifting the green scarf completely from her shoulder. It fluttered across her back before settling against the metal bench. The girl startled at the sudden cold and hugged her arms to her chest. Walt rose halfway, instinct nudging him forward, but Frank's presence at his back held him in place more firmly than any rule posted on the depot wall. For a moment, all three stood in a triangle of tension, one man bound by policy, one man bound by conscience, and one child bound by circumstance. Another whistle sounded somewhere far off, a reminder that the morning wouldn't pause for them. The girl took a small step toward the rail, trying to peer down the tracks, unaware of how slick the frost had become there. Walt's breath caught as he saw her foot slide just a fraction more than it should have on safe ground. She stepped closer to the slick rail, and the metal beneath her tilted a warning back at him in the pale light. Walt moved quickly along the edge of the platform, the boards creaking under his boots as he traced the widening frost. The ice had thickened in the last few minutes, running in streaks across the wood like pale veins. He pressed his hand flat against one patch, and it gave the slightest crunch beneath his glove, more brittle, more dangerous than he'd hoped. He straightened and called over his shoulder, "Frank, this ice won't hold." Frank tightened his grip on the clipboard, the metal clip tapping once against the top as if punctuating his answer. "Submit Form 27A first. You know the rules." His voice carried that official edge, the one that came out whenever he leaned on the system to shield himself. Walt didn't need to see Frank's face to know he wasn't trying to be harsh. He was trying to stay safe inside the regulations. But the words landed with weight anyway, heavy enough to pin Walt where he stood. The quiet refugee girl stepped back from the bench, inching toward the tracks without realizing it. The frost was thinnest near the siding, but thickest exactly where she was trying to get a better view. Walt caught the way her foot hovered over a patch of frozen sheen that reflected the sky like a fragile mirror. "Stay there," he called, but the rising wind stole half the sound. She hesitated, eyes unsure, toes still pointed toward the danger she couldn't see. A hollow clatter sounded from his coat pocket as his service honor coin shifted and struck against the seam. Walt closed his hand around it, feeling the cool metal settle into his palm. The small weight steadied him, calling up the same quiet promise it always had. Hold steady, look twice, decide with care. He drew a breath so cold it stung, then stepped closer to the girl, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency building inside him. Frank edged nearer, but instead of helping, he raised the clipboard again like a barrier. "Walt, don't start something. You'll have to explain later," he said softer this time, but still wrapped in caution. It was the kind of warning that made rules feel louder than reason. The wind pushed a curl of steam from the girl's breath across the rails where it dissolved into the morning air. Walt's jaw tightened. She didn't belong anywhere near that brittle sheet of ice, but the rules boxed him in on all sides. He closed his eyes just long enough to hear the faint rattle of the coin again. The sound drew a line straight through his indecision. He opened them to see the girl take another tiny step toward the rail, trusting nothing but her own guess about where it was safe. Walt's thoughts tangled, pulling him in opposite directions. If I wait, it's wrong. If I act, it's wrong. The morning train rounded the bend with a low, steady rumble, its headlights cutting through the pale dawn like a quiet announcement that time had run out. Walt felt the vibration before he heard the brakes bite a deep tremor through the boards beneath his boots. The girl flinched at the sound, instinctively stepping back toward the worst patch of ice on the platform. Walt didn't think, he simply moved. He reached for the side gate, the one marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and pulled it open in one swift motion. The hinges groaned in protest as if they understood the weight of what he was doing. He stepped through and guided the girl with him, one hand steadying her shoulder, the other sweeping his heavy coat off and draping it over her narrow frame before the next gust could cut through her. The coat swallowed her small shape, but she held its edges gratefully. Frank's voice broke across the platform. "Walt, you broke protocol." He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The words carried enough force simply being spoken aloud, as though the rules themselves had been summoned to take note. Walt felt the truth of them land, but he didn't look back. His focus stayed on the girl on the way. Her breath shook on the thinness of her sleeves, on the fear she tried so hard to hide. The wind surged again, sharper than before, flinging her scarf backward. Walt caught the green fabric before it slipped away and wrapped it gently around her neck, tightening the knot so it sealed out the cold. Her eyes lifted to his wide, startled, but full of a trust she hadn't known how to voice. The train hissed as it finally slowed, steam curling past them in long ribbons. It was a small, quiet mercy, one no one would ever record. The kind that didn't earn recognition or praise and maybe wasn't meant to. Walt felt it settle inside him anyway, steady and right. A sharp crack shattered the moment. The ice sheet where the girl had stood just seconds earlier split down the center, a jagged vein racing outward across the boards. Frank stopped mid-step. Clipboard half raised his breath, catching as he understood what would have happened had Walt waited even a heartbeat longer. The clipboard sagged in his hand, the gesture collapsing under its own weight. Steam drifted around them, soft and white in the dawn light as the girl leaned closer to Walt for warmth. The train doors hissed open, but no one stepped out yet. The world held still, caught between danger avoided and the fragile calm that followed. Frank lowered the clipboard completely, fingers loosening. It no longer had the strength to accuse. The train came to a smooth final stop, brakes sighing as though relieved to reach the platform without incident. Warm air spilled from the open doors, brushing past Walt and the girl in a gentle wave. Frank stood a few paces away, eyes fixed on the long crack slicing across the boards where danger had been building all morning. He studied it for a quiet moment, the clipboard hanging loose at his side. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier rigidity. "You did right," he said almost to the crack itself before looking up at Walt. "I'll handle the report." The girl held Walt's coat tightly around her. Her fingers curled into the wool like she feared the cold might reclaim her the moment she let go. She stepped toward him with a small bow of her head, shy, grateful, careful. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a worn envelope, edges softened from being carried too long. She placed it on the bench beside him and set her green scarf over it with both hands, smoothing the fabric the way someone might fold a promise. When she spoke, the words were soft but sure. "Thank you." Walt waited until she boarded before he picked up the envelope. Inside lay a small drawing, simple pencil lines forming the depot, the siding bench, and two figures standing side by side. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for safe morning." He let the message rest in his palm, the sincerity of it sinking deeper than the cold ever could. He rubbed his thumb over the top edge of his service honor coin, feeling the familiar ridges warm under his touch. Frank walked toward the Red Cross parcel shelf, his steps slower than usual. He set the clipboard down on the metal surface, leaving the report page unsigned. The gesture was small, but it carried the shape of a man deciding which part of himself he wanted to honor today. He stepped back a single pace as if giving the moment room to settle. A faint breeze slipped down the platform, lifting the end of the green scarf still folded on the bench. The fabric fluttered once the lightest movement like a final nod, then stilled as the depot lamps flickered above. The platform emptied slowly, footsteps fading into the hush that always followed the early train. Walt stayed behind on the last bench along the siding, letting the quiet settle around him. The cold morning light stretched across the depot in long silver lines, and at dawn the sun finally broke clean over the tree line. Its first sweep of brightness slipped across the worn coin in his hand and the neatly folded green scarf resting beside him. The two objects caught the light like small pieces of memory, steady and unspoken. He exhaled and his breath turned into a pale cloud that drifted upward before dissolving into the crisp air. The cold carried a certain clarity with it, the kind that made every sound stand out more sharply. The groan of the overhead lamp, the faint rattle of a loose sign, the wind brushing across the snow-covered siding. Walt pulled his coat tighter, more out of habit than for warmth, and ran his thumb again along the familiar edge of the coin. It warmed quickly, as it always did, grounding him in a way few things could. Across the lobby, the waiting room lights flickered once and steadied. A soft glow spilled through the window, catching the surface of the old library case and painting a warm stripe across the snow on the platform. Walt watched the reflection shift slightly as the wind moved through, gentle but insistent. The library case had stood there longer than most things in the depot, long enough to witness half a lifetime of mornings just like this one, and a few that were nothing like it at all. He leaned back against the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. There would be no reprimand today, Frank had made that clear, without needing any more words. And there would be no praise either, no announcement, no line in a report. The day would move on, the depot would open for its regular schedule, and by noon, the crack in the ice would be just another mark on the planks, already fading under the weight of new steps. Walt didn't mind. Not every right thing needed an audience. A gust of wind drifted down the length of the platform, nudging the folded scarf a fraction toward him. He steadied it with a hand, feeling the faint texture of its weave beneath his fingertips. The girl's drawing was tucked safely in his pocket now. He could feel its edges against the lining of his coat. He didn't need to look at it again to remember the shaky lettering or the care that had gone into each pencil stroke. He knew it by heart already. The sky continued to brighten, that gentle blue that only appeared in the first hour of morning. Snow glimmered under the growing light, and the rails gave off a muted shine. The world seemed to breathe in deeply, readying itself for another day. Walt sat a little straighter, coin still in his hand, scarf still beside him, the quiet around him filling every space words couldn't reach. Mercy doesn't need witnesses, he thought, the truth of it settling with the warmth of the rising sun. The depot settled back into its gentle rhythm, the kind only small towns seem to hold at daybreak. The first rays of sunlight washed across the library case and found Walt still seated on the quiet bench, the green scarf folded beside his old service coin, the two objects catching a soft glow like pieces of someone's better nature left out in the open. What happened that morning would slip into the kind of memory folks don't talk about but carry anyway, proof that dignity doesn't always announce itself and kindness doesn't wait for permission to matter. And as the light climbed higher over the tracks, he breathed in the cold air and let the thought settle deep inside him. Mercy keeps its own ledger, even when no one is looking.